Officer Hayes thought he was having a little fun, flexing his authority by assigning my mother and I the table directly across from the yard's apex predator. He wanted to watch me sweat. He expected me to completely crack under the pressure of being so close to a certified monster. He had no idea who my mother was about to recognize. Instead of serving me up on a silver platter, his petty games were about to trigger a chain reaction he could never stop. Hayes was the kind of guard who got off on the microscopic sliver of power his badge afforded him. He paced the perimeter of the visiting room with a smug, infuriating swagger, flashing a condescending smirk whenever he caught my eye. I was fresh meat. Upstate, your status is stamped right on your chest by the first two digits of your Department of Corrections number. Mine read 07R2447. I had just arrived in 2007, a total nobody, reeking of the raw anxiety that predators like Hayes loved. He leaned against the reinforced glass. He was practically vibrating with glee as he watched us squirm under the shadow of the monster sitting nearby. The guy sitting across from us was a hulking, dead-eyed ghost with an 88 number stamped on his greens. 1988. This man had been swallowed whole by maximum security before I was even old enough to ride a bike. He had a jagged scar ripping across his face. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Just him breathing sucked the oxygen out of the room. I was sweating bullets. But then I noticed something chilling. My mom wasn't looking at me. She was staring dead at him. I leaned across the scuffed plastic table, desperate to break her trance. "Ma, don't stare at him," I whispered, panic rising. "That's an 88. Look down." I shot a paranoid glance at Hayes, who was still smirking from the wall. I was terrified. I was completely out of my depth in a room full of lifers and predators, just trying to keep us off the radar and survive the visit.
She didn't even blink. "Quiet," she said. "I know him." We were locked in this tense standoff at the table now, completely ignoring the fact that Officer Hayes was openly chuckling from the wall. He was feeding off the domestic dysfunction he had orchestrated, assuming he had won. And then the scarred man stood up. He didn't look at me, and he didn't look at the guard. He locked his hollow eyes entirely on my mother. She stood up, planted her hands on the table, and said one word. "Rico?" The terrifying lifer stopped dead in his tracks. His heavy scowl melted, replaced by stunned disbelief. "Evelyn?" he breathed out. From that exact moment, the prison's power dynamic shifted. Hayes' smirk vanished. He had set the stage for a public humiliation, but instead, he had accidentally brokered an unbreakable alliance. The immediate aftermath of that visiting room reunion ate away at Officer Hayes like battery acid. But guys like Hayes don't know when to quit. As soon as my mother's visitor pass expired and the heavy steel doors clanged shut, Hayes made it his personal mission to make my bid a living hell. He pulled me out of the line on the walk back to the block. He deliberately crowded my personal space, pinning me against the rough cinder block wall. "You think you're special because that scarred-up fossil said hello to your mommy, inmate?" he sneered, his breath hot and reeking of stale coffee. For the next 3 weeks, Hayes escalated his harassment campaign to a pathological level. He tossed my cell every single shift he worked. I'd come back from the mess hall to find my mattress overturned. My letters from home were ripped apart and scattered across the damp concrete floor, and my painstakingly folded state-issue clothes were stomped on with muddy combat boots. He started writing me up for phantom infractions, shoelaces untied, bed made improperly, failure to comply with a direct order he never gave. He was systematically trying to build a disciplinary jacket thick enough to send me to the special housing unit. He aimed to strip away my phone privileges and isolate me from Rico's influence. The climax of his pathetic power trip happened during a mandatory tier lockdown. Hayes stopped right in front of my bars,
casually tapping his nightstick against the rusted iron. He leaned in so close I could see the burst capillaries in his nose. "I'm gonna bury you, kid," he whispered, "and when you break, I'll call Evelyn myself and tell her you didn't make it." It was the ultimate bait, a desperate attempt to provoke an outburst that would add 5 years to my sentence. But I didn't snap. I didn't yell. I didn't lunge at the bars, and I didn't even clench my fists. I just stood there, my breathing incredibly slow and measured. Rico had spent the last 21 days educating me on the true currency of maximum security: patience. I let my eyes trace the sloppy, unbuttoned collar of Hayes's uniform, memorizing his badge number for the 1,000th time. My resting heart rate didn't spike a single beat. I just stared right through him, offering absolutely nothing but a cold, blank canvas. The total absence of fear unnerved him. His smug grin faltered for a fraction of a second, his tiny ego unable to process why the prey wasn't panicking. What Hayes didn't know was that while he was busy trashing my cell, Rico and I were building a paper guillotine. Upstate, physical violence just gets you more time, but a perfectly executed legal trap destroys a guard's livelihood. Rico wasn't just a lifer, he was a legendary jailhouse lawyer. He had spent the last 2 decades studying the Department of Corrections Employee Handbook, union contracts, and federal civil rights statutes. We had quietly documented every single unprovoked cell toss, every missing piece of mail, every phantom write-up. We cross-referenced them with the tier's security camera blind spots and the shift logs of other, more honest guards. The following morning, I played my hand. During recreation, I walked straight past the weight pile and headed directly for the legal phone. It was a line that by federal and state law, the facility could not record or block. I punched in the number Rico had slipped into my palm the day before. It wasn't a family member. It was a vicious, high-profile civil rights attorney in Manhattan who owed Rico a massive favor. I read off the meticulously detailed ledger of Hayes' abuses. I provided exact timestamps, witness accounts from 3 other inmates, and a pattern of targeted harassment that violated a half-dozen state protocols. I hung up the receiver, turned around, and caught Hayes glaring at me from the gun tower. I didn't smile. I just gave him a slow, single nod. The trap was officially set. The fallout didn't happen overnight. It arrived 3 weeks later, quiet and lethal. It was a Tuesday morning during the 8 a.m. count. The heavy steel doors of the cell block didn't just slide open for the usual shift change. Instead, a detail from the Inspector General's office, flanked by the facility superintendent, marched straight on to the tier. They bypassed the control bubble entirely and walked directly to where Officer Hayes was casually leaning against the railing, his trademark smug grin plastered across his face. When the superintendent ordered him to surrender his keys and radio, right there on the catwalk, the silence on the block was absolute. Hayes scoffed, assuming it was a bureaucratic mix-up, but his arrogance blinded him to the storm he had just walked into. They escorted him to the administrative wing, straight into a conference room where my Manhattan attorney was waiting alongside 2 state investigators. Hayes swaggered in. He fully expected his union rep to bail him out of whatever minor policy violation he thought he'd caught. But then, the attorney slid a 3-inch thick binder across the mahogany table. It contained every phantom write-up, every documented piece of destroyed mail, and a sworn, undeniable timeline, a timeline cross-referenced with the civilian contractor logs that proved Hayes had been intentionally utilizing camera blind spots. I wasn't in that room, but the attorney told me later about the exact second the color completely drained from Hayes' face. He suddenly realized that the terrified '07 new kid he'd been torturing wasn't defenseless. He was under the protection of a jailhouse legend. a man who'd spent 20 years perfecting the art of destroying corrupt guards.
The crushing blow was absolute and entirely legal. The union immediately abandoned him the second the words federal civil rights violation hit the table, because Rico had guided me to document the harassment as a targeted, retaliatory deprivation of rights. Hayes wasn't just facing administrative termination. He was looking at severe criminal charges and the total, permanent forfeiture of his state pension. The microscopic sliver of power he had worshipped was stripped away in less than 20 minutes. He was ordered to empty his locker. His badge was confiscated, and he was escorted off the prison grounds in civilian clothes, pale and speechless, as the state police placed him in the back of an unmarked cruiser. He had tried to bury me to stroke his own ego. Instead, he had dug his own financial and professional grave. Later that afternoon, out in the damp, overcast recreation yard, I stood by the chain-link fence watching the last of the administration vehicles pull away from the perimeter. Rico walked up slowly, the deep, jagged scar on his face twisting into a rare, subtle smirk. He didn't say a word about Hayes. He just handed me a fresh apple from the mess hall, gave me a heavy pat on the shoulder. Rico went back to the bleachers. The threat was neutralized. My mom's old friend delivered, and for the rest of my bid, the guards looked right past me.